They say some family secrets are deadly. But what happens when the monster destroying your granddaughter's life is the man your own daughter calls husband? This is the story of a terrifying family betrayal, the price of silence, and a grandmother's fierce, desperate quest for revenge and justice in the heart of Phoenix, Arizona. I am Mary, and I sat in my small kitchen, meticulously arranging the dishes my granddaughter Sarah always adored. I had carefully prepared a comforting meal, hoping to coax some warmth back into her hollow frame. Sarah is studying at Arizona State University, living in the student dorms, and she hardly ever comes to visit me. Therefore, when she suddenly showed up at my front door this morning, I was immediately struck by a confusing mixture of joy and deep, unsettling concern. "Grandma, I missed you," she murmured, her voice soft, but her eyes, usually bright with the excitement of college life, were dull, almost opaque, as if she were desperately concealing a terrible weight. Instinctively, I knew something was profoundly wrong, yet I held back from pressing her for details, hoping that the comfort of home would be enough to draw her out. I rushed to the kitchen, checking the refrigerator to cook her a decent, nourishing meal. I figured a warm, home-cooked meal would surely make her feel better, a sensory link back to happier, safer times. I prepared the warm chicken noodle soup, the recipe she loved since she was a little girl, and placed it on the table in front of her. But Sarah just sat there, staring distractedly at the plate of white rice. The vibrant aroma of the soup, meant to be an invitation to comfort, seemed to do nothing. She barely managed to touch the food with her fork, picked up a minuscule piece of mashed potato, brought it to her mouth, and then, with a barely perceptible shudder, she put it back down. Her face was startlingly pale, her lips chapped and dry, and the usual energy, the vibrant spark of the girl who used to excitedly tell me about her days at college, had vanished entirely. I held back a heavy sigh, trying to maintain an atmosphere of gentle, unwavering calm. I used a soft voice, like I was trying to soothe a fragile child, and gently urged her, "Sarah, honey, you need to eat a little more. You are busy all day at school. I bet you aren't eating right at the dorms." She pressed her lips tightly together, forcing a weak smile, a fleeting expression so incredibly fragile it utterly broke my heart. "Grandma, I'm sorry. I honestly don't have an appetite." Her voice was barely a whisper, a low, exhausted sound, as if saying those few simple words took a monumental, agonizing effort. I looked down at the plate, almost untouched, and felt an overwhelming, crushing anxiety growing into a solid knot inside my chest. This was not the first time. For weeks now, every time she comes home, Sarah is exactly the same. The meals I prepare with so much devoted love and careful attention, she barely samples them, leaving them half-eaten, often completely cold. I silently collected the dishes, making an effort to hide the deepening worry that had begun to grip me constantly. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. What in the world was happening to my granddaughter at that prestigious university? The sudden and severe change in her eating habits, a classic sign of acute stress and emotional distress in young adults, was alarming, and yet I was grasping for an external, easy explanation. Late that night, when the faint, ghostly moonlight streamed through the window panes, I went out to the yard to sweep up the dry, brittle leaves that had fallen from the brilliant bougainvillea bush. My small house on the dusty outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, was nothing fancy. It was just a quiet sanctuary, a humble refuge in the middle of exhausting, often difficult days. I held the broom and swept slowly, my mind circling ceaselessly back to Sarah, to her pallor and her silence. Suddenly, a light shone from the kitchen door, illuminating a corner of the yard in a stark, yellow glow. I was violently startled to see Sarah bent over the bougainvillea pot, her thin shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She was throwing up nonstop, her whole body convulsing, desperately trying to expel something unseen and terrible. Then, with a frantic urgency, she quickly wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked around, her eyes wide with terror, clearly terrified that anyone might see her. "Sarah, are you sick?" I rushed toward her, my heart plummeting to my stomach. "Let me make you some hot herbal tea. It will help settle your stomach, honey." I reached out and gently touched her shoulder, but Sarah abruptly pulled away, replying in a weak, defeated voice, "It's just a stomach bug, Grandma. I must have caught something at the dorm." Her eyes meticulously avoided mine, a clear, desperate sign, as if she were desperately concealing a terrible, earth-shattering secret. I wanted to press her, to demand the truth, but seeing her ashen face and the clear physical strain, I could only nod, though inside me a hot, terrifying wave of panic and suspicion began to rise relentlessly. The fact that she was actively purging, a common yet painful physical manifestation of severe mental anguish, pointed to a crisis far beyond a simple stomach flu. That night I sat in my room, clutching an old shirt, half folded in my trembling hands. The house was strangely, unnaturally silent, a quiet that screamed louder than any noise. Only the steady, monotonous tick-tock of the old wall clock could be heard. I tried to focus on every crease of the fabric, but my mind kept forcefully returning to Sarah. She was not all right. I knew it with absolute, heartbreaking certainty. When had those clear eyes, which used to sparkle with untamed ambition when she talked about her dreams of becoming a lawyer, become so profoundly somber and empty? I told myself with a firm resolve that I had to talk to her, to break through her silence and find out what hidden terror was going on. And then, as if she had been mysteriously listening to my very thoughts, a soft, tentative knock sounded on the door. The door opened slowly, almost agonizingly, and Sarah walked in. Her figure was fragile, heartbreakingly delicate, like a dry leaf about to crumble to dust. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her trembling hands tightly hugged a pillow, clutching it to her chest as if it were the only anchor holding her upright in the turbulent sea of her despair. I immediately put the shirt aside. My heart was pounding hard with the crushing, paralyzing certainty that something awful, something utterly life-altering, was about to be revealed. Sarah stood there, hesitating for a long, agonizing moment. Her lips moved, forming silent, meaningless shapes, but not a single audible word came out. Finally, she let herself sink slowly, utterly defeated, to the floor, the pillow still clutched for dear life. Her voice was choked and broken, weak as the faintest wind that slips through a crack in the wall, and she whispered the words that would change everything. "Grandma, the truth is, I'm pregnant." The garment I had in my hand dropped unnoticed to the floor. I froze solid, my mind reeling, frantically searching for a reason, an explanation, any logical sequence of events. I opened my mouth, ready to ask about Jason, Sarah's longtime boyfriend, the boy I had seen a couple of times, the one she swore truly loved her and respected her. But before I could utter his name, Sarah frantically shook her head, tears pouring down her face like a flash flood of rain. "No, it's not him," she choked out. It's my stepfather." Those two words, my stepfather, landed with the terrifying force of a shard of ice stabbing directly into my heart. I was left completely breathless, with the horrifying sensation that my whole, carefully constructed world was crashing down violently around me. Harold, the man my only daughter, Linda, had married. The man I had genuinely believed was the family's salvation, the unshakable pillar of support for both mother and daughter after so many tough, hard years. How could it possibly be him? I stared at Sarah, wanting desperately to scream, to refute, to say something, anything, but my throat was completely constricted, as if a massive, immovable rock was lodged there, preventing me from speaking or even breathing properly. This devastating news was not just a violation, it was a total demolition of my family's perceived safety. Sarah knelt there on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. Her devastating sobs tore through the silence of the room, a sound of absolute, pure agony. "Grandma, it happened so many times. I didn't dare tell anyone. He threatened to hurt Mom if I spoke up. He said no one would ever believe me." She buried her face deep in her hands, her fingers digging fiercely into her hair as if she were trying desperately to hide from the entire world, from the shame and the terror. I couldn't endure it anymore. The sheer, blinding rage, the visceral pain, and the overwhelming helplessness mixed together inside me, making me tremble violently from head to toe. The psychological mechanism of grooming and coercion, using threats against a loved one to enforce silence, is a tragically common pattern in cases of incestuous abuse, and Harold had wielded it expertly against my child. I rushed to her, knelt down, and embraced her fragile, shaking body. My own tears streamed out, joining those of my granddaughter in a bitter, shared grief. "Oh God, my poor child," I kept repeating, my voice shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you have to carry this monumental burden alone?" I held her tight in my arms, feeling every shaky, shallow breath against my chest. In that instant, I saw reflected in her pain the shadow of the woman I had been when I was young, when life had also pushed me into dark, terrifying corners, places I thought I would never, ever escape from. But I survived, and I swore right then and there that I wouldn't let my granddaughter fall. "We have to go to the police immediately, Sarah," I said, my voice suddenly firm, steely, despite the tears still running freely. "Right away. I am not going to let him keep hurting you, or anyone else." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with raw, paralyzing fear, but crucially, with a tiny, fragile spark of hope, a desperate lifeline she was clinging to. She nodded weakly. With trembling hands, I picked up the old rotary telephone from the table, my grip slipping from sweat as I dialed the emergency number. The voice on the other end was monotonous, indifferent, but I forced myself to maintain my composure and scheduled an appointment with the police for the following day at the precinct downtown. When I finally hung up, I hugged Sarah again, tighter this time, and whispered a promise into her hair. "I'm right here. You don't have to be afraid. We'll face this together." The immediate, firm decision to involve law enforcement, despite the social stigma and family risk, was the first defining act of defiance against a deeply entrenched evil. A battle for truth had just begun, but before it could even be fought, I knew I had to understand the history that led us to this dark, desperate night, a history I had willfully ignored. The next morning, the fragile light of dawn spilled golden flashes over the small patio of the house, a light that was supposed to bring warmth and comfort, but today it only seemed to accentuate the heavy, cold dread settling deep within me. I watched Sarah, my granddaughter, sitting in an old wooden chair next to the patio table, desperately trying to drink the milk I had prepared for her. Her hands were shaking, the bowl tilting dangerously, as if every single sip were an internal, agonizing battle. Her face remained pale, her eyes lost, staring into a place I couldn't reach, a silent echo of the trauma she carried. I desperately wanted to offer reassurance, but once again, my throat constricted painfully, the words lodging themselves uselessly. I put the basket of vegetables on the ground, pretending to concentrate on separating each leaf of lettuce, a meaningless distraction, but my mind had already traveled backward, back to a past I once cherished. The memories returned with a painful, crushing clarity, as if the events had transpired only yesterday, not 20 years ago. I recalled the image of Linda, my only daughter, entering her wedding with Robert at the old St. Michael's Chapel. Linda was radiant in her simple white dress, a genuine, luminous smile on her face, and Robert, a good-hearted young man, was there in a borrowed suit, his hands roughened by honest, hard work, yet his sincere smile lit up that whole corner of the humble church. The entire community came to give their blessings. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and although the place was humble, the atmosphere was genuinely warm and full of hope. I stood among the crowd, tears of pure, unadulterated happiness silently falling, convinced my daughter had found a good man, someone who would protect and cherish her for the rest of her life. Their first years together unfolded like a sweet, uncomplicated dream. Every morning, Robert would don his bright yellow hard hat, push his old motorcycle toward the construction site, and whistle a cheerfully optimistic tune. When he returned in the evening, he unfailingly brought a small paper bag of candy for Sarah, who was then just a tiny girl with lively pigtails. I still perfectly remember Robert crouching down in front of the porch, carefully handing the candy to Sarah. The girl laughed, her eyes squinted with joy, and she ran into his arms, calling him Daddy in a clear, loving voice. That image, that pure bond, was the greatest joy for me. Undeniable proof that even if life was tough and offered many struggles, our family was filled with genuine, unconditional love. But that happiness, I now realized, was fragile, like the paper decorations in the yard, easily swept away and destroyed by the wind. When Sarah turned 6 years old, a devastating work accident took Robert away forever. The scaffolding on the job site collapsed, and he died instantly, without getting to say a final word, his honest labor costing him his life. I vividly remember that day. The sky was heavy and gray, and a cold drizzle was falling. Linda collapsed over the simple wooden coffin, crying until she had no more tears left, and Sarah, so small in her black dress, hugged her father's picture, her gaze vacant, not understanding why Daddy wasn't coming back to tuck her in. I was there, holding both of them, my heart shattered into pieces, and I could only whisper the useless promise, "Everything will be all right. We will get through this together." The years that followed were a grueling string of hard times. Linda struggled alone to raise Sarah. By day, she worked tirelessly as an accountant in a small tailoring shop, and at night, she stayed up late with more ledger books to earn desperately needed extra money. I watched my daughter wear herself out little by little. Those eyes that once shone with love now only showed exhaustion and despair. I helped in whatever way I could, watching Sarah, cooking meals, but no matter how hard we tried, I felt that our family was like a small boat being dragged by a merciless current with nothing solid to hold on to. This struggle is not unique. It is the silent, pervasive reality for hundreds of thousands of single mothers in Arizona who face an average poverty rate far exceeding the national average. Until one day, Harold appeared. He entered Linda and Sarah's lives like a supposed savior, appearing impeccable and elegant, his white shirt neatly pressed, his expensive leather shoes gleaming under the Sunday. Harold Benton was the chief executive officer of the environmental company, Clearwater, a man of undeniable power and money, very different from the simple, working-class men of our town. He pursued Linda relentlessly, brought her expensive bouquets of flowers, invited mother and daughter to fancy restaurants that we could only look at from the outside before. The neighbors soon started whispering, "Linda is really lucky. A widow, and yet an executive notices her." I heard those comments and felt a confusing blend of joy and fear. Joy because I thought that God was finally compensating my daughter for her suffering, but fear because Harold's eyes sometimes turned strangely cold, hard, as if hiding a profound, disturbing something I couldn't quite figure out. Sarah was barely 10 years old, still timid, and she called him Uncle Harold. I remember she once told me in an innocent, delighted voice, "Uncle Harold bought me a new backpack. It's really nice, Grandma." I smiled then, stroking her hair, genuinely thinking that perhaps Harold sincerely wanted to be a good, responsible father figure. His wedding with Linda was celebrated lavishly at the most luxurious hotel in the city. Even the local news mentioned it, a splash of high society glamour in our otherwise quiet lives. He had Sarah enrolled in a prestigious private school, something we had only dared to dream of before. Everyone proclaimed that my daughter had finally found a good husband, a man fully capable of protecting the whole family from poverty and hardship. In my innocence, I believed it too. I thought we had finally escaped the gnawing anxiety of poverty, that Linda and Sarah would live surrounded by care and security. But Sarah's desperate confession last night demolished everything, leaving the rubble of my faith behind. The beautiful, fragile memories of a happy family were now nothing more than a ripped painting, savagely exposing a terrible, hidden truth. Harold, the man I believed to be a benefactor, turned out to be a monster who had built his golden life on a foundation of lies and terror. How could a life built on a sacrifice of honesty and genuine love, like Robert's, be so easily overshadowed by a monster whose power lay only in money and manipulation? I decided to prepare a pot of light oatmeal, hoping the aroma of the rice mixed with a little chopped chives would encourage Sarah to manage a few spoonfuls. The girl was still sitting at the patio table, avoiding the milk, only a few sips taken. I brought the steaming bowl, placed it carefully in front of her, forcing a gentle, encouraging smile. "Sarah, eat a little oatmeal, even just a few spoonfuls, so you can have strength for the day." But she just looked at the bowl, her fork barely brushed the edge before she released it. Her face was paper white, her eyes swollen and red, as if the entire world had drained every last ounce of life and will from her. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I can't swallow," she whispered so weakly that I had to lean in close to hear her. I just nodded, hiding the fresh wave of pain that was tearing me apart inside, and silently took the untouched bowl away. I put on my old worn woolen shawl, the same one I had used for so many years, from when I cradled Linda as a baby to now with Sarah. Today, I took my granddaughter's ice-cold hand and led her out to face the world, toward the police precinct in the center of the town. The street in the morning was noisy and busy with motorcycles and street vendors, but inside me, there was only a terrifying, deep silence, as if everything were muffled by the sheer, paralyzing dread of what was to come. Sarah walked beside me, her hand icy, squeezing mine tightly, her thin shoulders trembling. The path to justice is rarely smooth, but I knew, as we approached the imposing official building, that the indifference we would face might be more painful than the crime itself. I squeezed Sarah's hand hard, trying to project a certainty I didn't fully possess, and whispered to her, "Grandma is here. Don't be afraid. We're going to tell the whole, ugly truth." Yet, she kept her gaze stubbornly downcast, as if she desperately wished to disappear completely from the world, to melt into the noisy pavement. The precinct was on a corner, its exterior walls painted an appealing, official white, but inside, the atmosphere was stuffy, loud, and oppressively bureaucratic. Some local farmers were waiting listlessly on hard wooden chairs to resolve land disputes, their loud, exasperated voices mixing with the tired sighs of the officers. A street vendor in the corner was crying, recounting how her old motorcycle had been stolen, her small tragedy quickly forgotten by the official machinery. I guided Sarah to the counter where a middle-aged officer sat, listlessly leafing through a massive ledger and chewing gum with loud indifference. He looked at us, his expression bored and indifferent, and asked without any inflection, "What do you need?" I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my voice to be clear and unwavering, and I told him everything from Sarah's terrifying confession last night, how her stepfather, Harold Benton, had committed terrible, unspeakable acts. I spoke clearly, every single word emphasized with the weight of raw truth. He abused my granddaughter more than once. My granddaughter is pregnant, and that is a direct consequence of what he did to her. The officer flinched noticeably, his pen frozen in the air over the ledger. He looked up at me, then his gaze shifted to Sarah, a trace of confusion and disbelief replacing his indifference. "Say that again," he muttered. "Did you say it's Mr. Harold Benton, the director of the Clear Water Company?" His voice dropped, hushed with a sudden reverence, as if he couldn't believe his own ears or the sheer audacity of the accusation. I nodded firmly, feeling a cold, righteous anger begin to burn fiercely in my chest. "That's right. It's him. I want to file a report, and I demand justice for my granddaughter." Sarah, next to me, hugged her old backpack so tightly her knuckles were white, her swollen eyes fixed rigidly on the floor, as if a single glance from a stranger could make her shatter into a million pieces. The officer sighed heavily, glanced nervously at a colleague nearby, and then shook his head in a gesture of weary dismissal. Another officer, who seemed to be higher ranking, a man whose uniform suggested authority, approached and tried to offer a conciliatory smile, but I only saw cold, calculating deceit in his expression. "Mrs. Mary," he began, his voice smooth and oily, but undeniably filled with calculation, "this is an extremely sensitive matter. Frankly, the best thing would be for you to quietly go back home and discuss this difficult situation with your family. Don't make a big fuss. It would be a huge embarrassment for everyone involved." An embarrassment? That single word, used to describe the terror and violation my granddaughter endured, was like a direct stab to my core. I stood up abruptly, slamming my hand down on the desk with a force that surprised even me. My voice trembled not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated fury. Embarrassment? What possible embarrassment can there be when my granddaughter, barely 20 years old, is carrying the blood of a monster? Do you people even have a conscience left? Suddenly, the entire room fell into a terrifying silence. Some people, the waiting farmers and the crying vendor, turned to stare openly at us. The ranking officer clicked his tongue in exasperation, quickly wrote a few lines in his notebook, and then snapped it shut, a clear signal meant to dismiss the issue entirely. "The file will be sent to the superior authorities for review. You go back home. If there is anything to report, we will contact you later." His voice was utterly monotonous, devoid of any ounce of human emotion, as if my desperate words were nothing more than a passing breeze, a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. I wanted to scream, to demand that they act immediately, to show even a flicker of human compassion. But seeing Sarah, small and huddled next to me, I knew I had to save every ounce of my strength to protect her. I took her hand, pulling her out of the precinct, my heart ripped apart by the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. This refusal to act, disguised as caution, is a classic example of how power structures, both economic and political, intervene to protect the elite, a pattern tragically common in many U.S. communities where wealthy donors effectively shield themselves from local law enforcement. Outside, the scorching Phoenix sun beat down with a suffocating heat that made me dizzy. Sarah walked beside me, dissolved in heartbreaking sobs, those small, desperate whimpers that seemed to tear the very air. I held her fragile shoulders, trying to transmit a strength that I wasn't even sure I still possessed. "I am not going to let this be swept under the rug, Sarah," I told her, my voice firm despite the shattering of my own heart. "We are going to find justice, even if it takes everything we have." She only nodded in silent agreement, tears streaming incessantly down her cheeks. We took a taxi back home. The driver, a middle-aged man with a face marked by the harshness of a tough life, looked at us through the rearview mirror with curiosity. "Coming from the police station?" he asked flatly. I nodded, not wanting to talk, but he continued, his words landing like heavy stones. "In this town, lawsuits against him are useless. Mr. Benton has already arranged everything from the top down. Everyone here knows it." Every word of his was like another sharp thorn digging deep into my chest, confirming my worst fears about systemic corruption. I remained silent, but a terrifying storm raged in my head. Sarah turned her face toward the window, letting the tears fall nonstop, as if wanting desperately to hide her immense pain from the whole world. Upon arriving home, I prepared a glass of warm lemon water, hoping to give Sarah a small measure of relief. I took the glass to her room, but she was still huddled in bed, hugging the pillow, neither eating, drinking, nor saying a single word. I sat beside her, gently stroking her hair, my soul in pieces. "Rest. Everything is going to be fine," I murmured, a hollow promise I barely believed myself. I barely slept that night, my mind full of painful, unanswered questions. Could Harold, with his money and power, truly hide his monstrous crime forever? And Linda, my own daughter, did she really know who her husband was beneath the impeccable suit? I picked up my old phone and dialed Linda's number. Her voice sounded on the other end of the line, sweet as always, but now so distant, so alien. "Mom, why are you calling me so late?" she asked, her tone slightly annoyed. I took a deep breath, trying desperately to keep my voice calm and steady. "Linda, I need to see you. I'm coming to your house tomorrow, okay? It's something important." "About Sarah." She hesitated for an agonizing moment, a silence that spoke volumes, and then she replied, "Yes, all right, Mom." I hung up with a heavy, sinking heart, knowing that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be easy. But I had to tell Linda the truth, even if that truth hurt her to the core, even if it meant destroying the golden facade of her perfect life. The next step would demand not only courage from Sarah, but a confrontation that threatened to tear the very fabric of my family apart, forcing my own daughter to choose between the illusion of wealth and the agonizing reality of her child's suffering. The next morning I woke up early, the daylight filtering through the crack in the door, weakly illuminating the old wooden floor, but utterly failing to dissipate the cold, heavy dread that covered my mind. Today, I knew. I had to take Sarah to see Linda, to tell her the whole, unvarnished truth, and I could not allow everything to remain buried in the darkness of silence. I looked at Sarah, who was curled up in a corner of the room, her eyes still swollen and bloodshot after crying all night long. "Get ready, sweetie. We're going to your mom's house," I said, trying to maintain a gentle, encouraging tone. She nodded weakly, but her gaze was empty, utterly lost, as if a simple breath of wind would be enough to knock her down. We took the public bus toward the affluent residential area where Linda and Harold lived in their luxurious mansion. The street leading to the neighborhood was smoothly paved and impeccably clean, lined with rows of perfectly manicured trees on both sides, a stark, jarring contrast to the dusty alley in front of my humble house. When the bus stopped, I took Sarah's hand, and we got off, walking in silence, both of us silently praying for the sheer strength to face the devastating confrontation that was coming. Linda's mansion appeared before us, expansive and majestic, with a marble courtyard that gleamed coldly under the Arizona Sunday. Harold's luxury car was parked conspicuously under the porch, gleaming as if freshly polished, a silent testament to the wealth that now shielded him. As soon as she saw the car, Sarah started trembling violently, squeezing my hand so hard it actually hurt. "Grandma, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice choked with barely contained panic. I pulled her close to me, stroking her back with a firm hand. "I'm here with you, Sarah. He can't hurt you anymore. Not with me here." I knocked firmly on the heavy door, my heart slamming against my chest like a trapped bird. Linda came out to open it, dressed in an elegant Gucci dress, her lips painted a deep, striking red, her hair perfectly curled and styled. She smiled, but her expression was distant, reserved, as if directed at a mere acquaintance, and certainly not her own mother and daughter. "Mom, Sarah, why did you come without calling first?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying a noticeable, subtle defensive edge. I didn't answer her polite question. I simply squeezed Sarah's hand and walked straight into the living room, ignoring all pretense of formality. The room was spacious, dominated by a ridiculously expensive leather sofa and luxurious artwork on the walls, but to me, it felt utterly cold and sterile, a gilded prison. I sat down, looked Linda straight in the eye, and spoke with firm, unyielding conviction, cutting through the pleasantries. "Linda, we have to talk seriously. Harold did something truly terrible to Sarah. The girl is pregnant, and that is a direct, horrifying consequence of what he did to her." Linda's carefully constructed face froze for an instant, her eyes widening with immediate disbelief at the brutal reality she had just heard. Then, suddenly, she let out a sharp burst of laughter, a cold, ironic, and completely terrifying sound. "Mom, please don't be ridiculous. Sarah just broke up with Jason. Obviously, it's his child, and now you're coming here to wildly accuse someone else." Her voice was sharp, cutting, clearly trying to shut down and invalidate my every word. I felt my blood boil with intense fury, but before I could respond, Sarah burst into uncontrollable tears, her voice trembling with despair. "No, Mom. I swear to you, it was him. Harold. Jason and I never." She couldn't finish the devastating sentence, her voice breaking into agonizing sobs. Slap. A loud, sickening slap echoed violently against Sarah's cheek, filling the silence of the luxurious room. Linda had jumped up, her eyes wide with a terrifying, wild fury, her face instantly turning red with a mixture of rage and panic. "Shut up!" she screamed, her voice broken and raw. "Do you dare to invent something like that just to ruin this family? Do you have any idea what you're saying, Sarah?" I stood there, utterly paralyzed, unable to believe that my own daughter, the child I raised with such sacrifice, could act this way. Sarah immediately covered her face, tears falling uncontrollably, trembling like a fragile leaf caught in a sudden storm. I ran to her, hugging her tightly, and yelled at Linda, my own voice hoarse with disbelief. "Linda, have you completely lost your mind? She is your daughter, your own flesh and blood. How can you hit her just because she's telling the truth?" Linda stood rigid, her hands shaking, her eyes full of terrifying rage and defensive disappointment. "Harold was the one who provided for this whole family," she shouted back, her voice nearly breaking with the sheer force of her denial. "He was the one who paid for Sarah's ridiculously expensive private school, who gave us a life we could only dream of before. And what about you, Sarah? You're just a stubborn, rebellious girl getting mixed up in foolish relationships. Do you dare to slander your stepfather?" Every single word Linda spoke was like a knife tearing violently at my heart. I looked at my daughter, whom I had raised with love, for whom I had sacrificed everything, and now she was standing in front of me like a cold, unfamiliar stranger, completely blinded by the blinding light of luxury and power, fiercely defending a monster who didn't deserve a shred of her loyalty. This phenomenon is tragically documented in sociology. The victim's proximity to the source of power, in this case, financial security, can lead to denial, a defense mechanism where the parent prioritizes the stability of the golden cage over the child's raw truth. Sarah buried her head deep in my shoulder, breathing in short, ragged gasps, her tears soaking my blouse. "Mom, you don't believe me," she whispered, her voice utterly broken. I hugged her hard, feeling like the whole world was collapsing violently around us. At that devastating moment, laughter and cheerful, oblivious voices were heard coming from the patio. I looked out the window and saw some employees from Harold's company who had arrived to pick him up for a meeting. He emerged, immaculate in his expensive suit, and barely gave us a cold, fleeting glance before calmly getting into the car. A phony, practiced smile remained fixed on his face, as if nothing profound had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed my granddaughter's life. That sight made my blood boil with renewed fury, but I knew that was not the time to confront the monster. Linda turned back to me, pointing decisively at the door with a trembling finger, her voice freezing with finality. "You two get out of my house immediately. I will not tolerate these disgusting lies in my home." I looked her straight in the eyes, desperately searching for any trace of the little Linda from before, the girl who hugged me, crying when she lost her father. But facing me was only an unfamiliar, cold woman, completely blinded and corrupted by money and influence. I didn't say anything more. I just hugged Sarah tightly and led her out of that cold, luxurious mansion. The profound, visceral agony of losing a child to a monster is only eclipsed by the pain of seeing your other child choose the monster's protection over blood, a betrayal that cut deeper than any abuse. On the way home, we took the bus, and Sarah was huddled against me, her tears falling silently but ceaselessly. I squeezed her hand tight, trying to transfer some of my fading strength to her, even though I myself was drowning in an agonizing blend of pain and fury. "I am not going to leave you alone, Sarah," I murmured into her hair, my voice thick with emotion. "Even if your mother doesn't believe you, I believe you, and I will do whatever is necessary to protect you." She didn't respond with words, only nodding slowly, but her fingers gripped mine harder, fiercely, as if I were her final, essential support in a world that had betrayed her. When we finally arrived back home, I prepared her a cup of hot tea and placed it gently in front of her, but she just sat there, staring blankly out at the small patio where the bougainvillea swayed silently in the gentle wind. I sat down next to her, my heart heavy with the realization that I had lost a part of Linda, the moment she chose to defend Harold's money instead of protecting her own daughter's life and truth. But I swore to myself right then and there that I wouldn't let anyone hurt Sarah again, even if it meant confronting my own daughter and potentially severing the family bond forever. After Linda threw us out of that icy mansion, I immediately decided that Sarah would stay and live with me. My small house on the dusty outskirts of Phoenix wasn't anything special. The plastered walls were yellowed by the years, the roof shingles mismatched after enduring so many heavy rains. It certainly wasn't luxurious or glamorous like the house Linda lived in, but at least it was a genuine haven of peace, a quiet sanctuary where I desperately hoped Sarah could regain a little light in her deeply wounded soul. I quickly fixed up the room that had once been Linda's, putting in a simple bed and covering it with the wool blanket I had woven myself long ago. "Stay here with me, sweetie," I said, gently stroking her hair. She only nodded, her gaze vacant, completely empty, as if no spark of life remained inside her. But genuine peace for Sarah seemed to have become an unreachable luxury, a distant memory. Every morning I got up early, cooked a pot of rice with a little fresh milk, and added some sugar to make it easier to swallow. I brought it to the table, placed it carefully in front of Sarah, and tried to force a small, cheerful smile. "Eat a little, even just a few spoonfuls, so you can keep your strength up." But she just looked at the bowl, her fork softly touching the rim before she released it, completely untouched. She would at most manage to swallow a few spoonfuls and then turn her face away, her empty gaze fixed on the quiet patio in front of the house, where the bougainvillea swayed silently in the wind. "Grandma, I'm not hungry," she whispered, her voice a mere thread of sound that I could barely strain to hear. I could only nod, silently hiding the profound pain that tore me up inside, and collected the bowl in silence, holding back the burning tears that threatened to fall. I tried to invite Sarah to the small vegetable garden to pick some fresh lettuce, hoping that the fresh air and a little light work would distract her from the internal turmoil. "Come on, help me pick some lettuce. We'll make the salad you like this afternoon," I told her, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful. But Sarah just sat listlessly in the small wooden chair, her hands unconsciously crushing the tender lettuce leaves, her gaze utterly lost as if she were traveling to a distant, unreachable place. I looked at her and felt my heart contract painfully. The girl who used to excitedly talk nonstop about her dreams of becoming a lawyer, of living vibrant, ambitious days at college, was now nothing more than an empty, fragile shell, a prisoner of her own profound, paralyzing pain. Her severe, persistent anorexia and withdrawal were clinical indicators of major depressive disorder, a necessary consideration that transcended mere sadness, requiring immediate, professional intervention, a reality often overlooked in the urgency of seeking criminal justice. One afternoon, while I was hanging laundry in the yard, I heard a sudden, terrible noise in the bathroom. A terrible, crushing premonition immediately told me something was very, very wrong. I ran inside, my heart pounding wildly against my ribs. The scene chilled me to the bone. Sarah was standing there, clutching a blister pack of abortion pills in her hands shaking uncontrollably, and her eyes red with a look of sheer, desperate terror. "Sarah!" I screamed, running toward her and fiercely snatching the pills away. "What are you trying to do?" My voice came out broken, a raw mixture of fear and blinding fury. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, immediately covering her face and crying uncontrollably. "I can't take this anymore, Grandma. I don't want to have this baby. He disgusts me. I disgust myself." Her crying tore through the air, every single word landing like a knife in my already broken heart. I knelt down beside her and hugged her tightly, tears also running down my own cheeks. "The baby is not to blame, Sarah," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "He is a part of you, and I will be here, carrying all of this with you." I held her for a long time, feeling every shaky, shallow breath, as if her whole body were fighting against an internal, violent storm. I knew my words alone couldn't ease her deep-seated pain, but I absolutely couldn't let my granddaughter destroy herself completely. "I promise you, you are not alone," I told her, squeezing her hand, even though I myself was drowning in an agonizing helplessness. A few days later, I took Sarah to a gynecological clinic on the outskirts of town, where an older female doctor, whom I had known for many years, worked. During the tense ride, Sarah barely spoke. She just huddled next to the bus window, tightly hugging her stomach, meticulously avoiding looking at me. At the clinic, the doctor confirmed that the baby was already more than 3 months old. "The girl is stable, but she needs special urgent care, both physical and emotional," the doctor said in a grave, low voice. When she carefully asked Sarah if she wanted to keep the baby, she remained completely silent, turning her face toward the cold wall, as if trying to escape the brutal reality of the situation. I took her hand firmly and nodded for her. "We will have the baby," I said with a firm, unwavering voice, although inside, I knew exactly how many monumental challenges that decision would bring to our already shattered lives. The decision was a complex one, steeped in a moral and emotional conflict where the grandmother's belief in the sanctity of life clashed with Sarah's desperate need to erase the physical manifestation of her trauma, a conflict that would define the next stage of their sorrowful journey. On the way back home from the clinic, we passed by the city hall where a small group of students was marching, waving banners passionately against corporate corruption. The shouts demanding justice for the people resonated loudly through the square, a powerful, distant sound of public outrage. Sarah suddenly lowered her head, clinging tightly to me as if terrified that the whole world would discover the painful secret she carried inside her swollen belly. "Don't be afraid, sweetie," I whispered, pulling her closer to my side. No one has the right to judge you for this." But I knew that Sarah's deep fear wasn't merely of people's stares. It was also the terrifying, growing weight in her womb, a weight she couldn't accept as part of herself. That night, I woke up in the early hours to a faint, unsettling noise. Sarah's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the pale, eerie moonlight streamed through the crack, illuminating her small, solitary silhouette. Sarah was sitting alone in the profound darkness, one protective hand on her growing stomach, murmuring through broken sobs, "Why me? Why?" Her words were like sharp knives twisting in my heart. I wanted desperately to go in and hug her, but my feet seemed stuck to the cold floor. I backed away silently, my soul utterly torn. I didn't know what else I could possibly do, except that the next day I returned to the market. I bought more milk, more fruit, more essential vitamins, determined to force her to eat. I only knew with absolute certainty that I had to protect Sarah and also the fragile, unwanted life growing inside her. Time passed in a painful, agonizing silence. Sarah's belly grew bigger every day, now round and noticeable even under the loose shirts. I deliberately chose to hide it from the curious glances of the neighbors. The girl hardly dared to leave the house, always shut up in her room, as if afraid that the whole world would discover the immense pain she carried. I understood completely that people's stares and whispers could be as sharp as knives, especially in a small community like Phoenix, where gossip traveled faster than the dry desert wind. Every time I took Sarah to the prenatal checkup, I wrapped her body in a large concealing shawl, hoping to hide her a little from the inquisitive, judging looks. "Walk close to me, sweetie," I would whisper, squeezing her hand tightly as we crossed the alley toward the bus stop, but Sarah just kept her head bowed low. She walked like a ghost, her thin shoulders trembling under the heavy shawl. I did everything, absolutely everything I could, to make Sarah's life a little more bearable. Every morning I went early to the market, carefully picked the freshest fruit, the greenest vegetables, hoping to cook something that would stimulate her non-existent appetite. I prepared milk soups. I even tried to make flan, her favorite dessert from before, but Sarah would just shake her head slowly, her gaze lost in the distance. "Grandma, I don't want to eat," she would say in a thread of a voice that I could barely hear. I would just nod sadly, hiding the growing pain in my chest. But every time I looked at her, I felt my heart clench until it almost physically broke. My granddaughter, the same intelligent girl who used to talk nonstop about her dream of being a lawyer, was now nothing more than an empty, silent shell, trapped in a relentless, profound pain that I couldn't share or alleviate. The day Sarah went into labor, the sky opened up in a furious, terrifying downpour. The drops slammed violently against the windows so hard that it seemed like they wanted to tear the world apart. I was in the kitchen, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I heard her agonizing groans coming from the room. "Grandma, it hurts so much," she called out in a weak and frightened voice. I ran to her immediately. I saw her hugging her stomach, her face pale, sweat covering her forehead in thick beads. "Calm down, sweetie. I'm taking you to the hospital right now," I told her, desperately trying to stay calm, even though I was as agitated inside as the storm raging outside. I called a taxi. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped the necessary papers as I tried to put them into my bag. On the way to the hospital, Sarah squeezed my hand with such force that her nails dug deep into my skin until it hurt sharply. "Grandma, don't leave me alone," she cried out between sobs that were tragically drowned out by the roar of the heavy rain. I hugged her and whispered to her, my voice strained. "I'm here, sweetie. I'm not going anywhere, ever." In the sterile delivery room, Sarah's heartbreaking screams echoed, tearing at my soul. I was by her side the whole time, tightly squeezing her hand, feeling every agonizing contraction through her clenched fingers. "Come on, Sarah, you are so strong," I encouraged her, even though tears were also streaming silently down my own face. Silently I prayed, begging heaven not to let any more pain or suffering fall upon my granddaughter. After hours of unrelenting tension and agony, the baby was finally born, a tiny, fragile boy, but his crying was weak, thin, fragile as a mere breath of wind. His little face was bruised, his eyes closed, and he didn't look at all like the healthy, robust babies I had seen before. The doctor, an older man with a sad, weary gaze, took me quietly to a corner and murmured the devastating truth. "The baby has a congenital heart defect, Mom. He's very delicate. He needs special, urgent care." His words were like a final knife stabbing into my chest, a cruel sentence. I looked at the little one, so tiny he fit in just one of my arms, and I felt my soul break completely. Sarah, exhausted and defeated from the childbirth, immediately turned her face away and fiercely refused to look at him. I don't want to see him. I hate him." She cried out through the tears, her words raw with pain. I froze, not knowing what on earth to say or do. Trembling, I took the baby carefully in my arms, held him tightly against my chest. He was so cold, so fragile, that he seemed he might vanish right there in my hands. I kissed his tiny forehead and whispered to him, "My grandson, your grandma is here. Don't be afraid." I rocked him gently, even though my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. That child, even though he was born in the middle of pain and trauma, was still Sarah's blood, part of our shattered family. The tragedy of the congenital defect, a devastating medical reality, layered an almost unbearable cruelty onto Sarah's trauma, confirming her darkest fears that this child was not meant to be a symbol of love, but a relentless reminder of the violation. The tragedy arrived swiftly and brutally, just hours after his weak first cry. Despite all the doctor's efforts, the baby boy's fragile heart simply gave out, and he died in my arms, small and cold, before the sun rose to meet the new day. I clung to his tiny body, a profound, soul-shattering grief washing over me, a pain far deeper than any loss I had known before. Sarah, still lying on the cold hospital bed, just turned her face away, refusing to even look at the dead child, an act of rejecting the trauma he represented. She didn't cry then, not a single tear. She was completely empty, paralyzed by the sheer exhaustion of her agonizing labor and the finality of the loss. I took the small, silent body and returned home alone, leaving Sarah to heal in the cold solitude of the hospital room, knowing that only time could begin to mend the devastation inside her. The days that followed were consumed by the devastating, lonely routine of arranging the baby's funeral, a small, heart-wrenching ceremony held under a mercilessly clear blue sky, with only me and the cemetery gardener present to bury the tiny coffin. Sarah finally returned home, but she was a ghost of her former self, completely withdrawn into a terrifying silence. She spent her days sitting listlessly by the window, her gaze fixed on the empty bougainvillea pot, refusing to eat or speak, a living testament to her broken spirit. Weeks passed this way, filled with a suffocating, painful quiet. I realized with a crushing finality that my constant presence and the silence of the house were not helping her heal, as the quiet was only deepening her profound despair. I desperately needed a way out, a distraction, anything to break the relentless cycle of her internal torment. One afternoon, compelled by a fierce, driving need for fresh air and human contact, I practically dragged Sarah out of the house. I forced her into a loose, comfortable dress and pulled the old shawl tight around her shoulders, intending to take her to the lively, bustling community market downtown, a place where life, in all its raw, vibrant forms, was undeniable. The market was loud, filled with the shouts of vendors and the smells of fresh fruit and savory street food, a jarring explosion of life that seemed to shock Sarah out of her catatonic state. She walked beside me, her eyes wide, slightly overwhelmed by the sudden noise and color, clutching my hands so tightly that my knuckles turned white. As we paused near a stall selling fresh, cheap vegetables, I overheard two vendors talking in hushed, angry tones, their voices thick with indignation. "Did you hear about the Clear Water Company?" One vendor whispered to the other, his face grim with clear worry. "Mr. Harold Benton, the big chief executive officer, he's being investigated for fraudulently inflating the water treatment contracts by 25%. It's all over the local news now." The other vendor shook his head vehemently, his eyes blazing with fury. "It's a huge scandal. The whole town is furious. He stole millions of United States dollars in federal funding, and the corruption goes right to the top of the city council." They continued. "They say he's already bribed half the local police force to keep the real investigation quiet, trying to make it look like just a financial audit." My whole body instantly froze, a sudden, blinding realization washing over me. The very name I heard Harold Benton was the same name the indifferent police officer had treated with such profound deference. The fear that had kept me paralyzed and powerless, the fear of Harold's immense, unassailable influence, suddenly began to crack and crumble. The revelation that his power was not built on legitimate, impenetrable authority but on blatant, widespread corruption was the vital spark of defiance I desperately needed. I glanced at Sarah, who was also listening, her eyes suddenly clear, focused, the paralyzing emptiness in them briefly replaced by a flicker of intense, chilling recognition. The financial scandal, a public betrayal of the community's trust, was the first concrete proof that Harold's seemingly solid kingdom was, in fact, built on sand, offering a completely new, public path to the justice that had been unjustly denied in the private, domestic sphere. I immediately pulled Sarah close and whispered into her ear, my voice firm with a renewed, fierce determination. They said he bought the police, Sarah, but they didn't buy the people. We are going to find someone who still believes in justice. I walked quickly toward the fish stall, the strong, metallic smell mixing with the market's heavy humidity, where I ran into Martha, an old friend who had once worked at Harold's company, Clearwater. Martha had retired some time ago, but the marks of years of struggle and the constant pressure of working under a predator were still painfully visible on her weary face. Recognizing me instantly, she immediately led me to a secluded, quiet corner and whispered close to my ear, her voice tight with residual fear. Mary, I already heard about Sarah, and I am so sorry. I went through the exact same thing with that monster. He called me to his office, locked the door, and tried to force himself on me. I was lucky to physically escape, but afterwards, I had to immediately leave the job. Everyone is terrified of him. No one dares to report him. Her voice visibly trembled as if that terrifying memory was still a fresh, open wound. I just nodded in silence, my heart heavy with the painful realization that it wasn't just Sarah. There were many more women who didn't have the strength, the family support, or the voice to confront him publicly. I left the market with my basket of vegetables, walking with heavy, purposeful steps along the dirt road that led home, Martha's words and the neighbors' hushed conversations echoing loudly in my mind. Passing near a group gathered at the market entrance, I managed to overhear a young woman urgently saying, "It's already circulating widely on the internet. People are actively collecting online signatures for the Environmental Protection Agency to investigate Clearwater." I stopped, fixating on a young woman taping a flyer to the wall. On it was a gruesome photo of the blackened dead river and a stark message. "Harold Benton, give us back our clean river." I squeezed the basket handles tightly, my heart pounding with a sudden, fierce hope. Sarah and I were clearly not the only ones who knew the terrible truth. Maybe, finally, justice was finding a different, powerful way to reach us. That night, Sarah and I sat in front of the old television, the one I had bought more than 10 years ago, with the screen blurred by the passage of time. The presenter's voice boomed, cutting sharply through the silence of the room, announcing, "Numerous official complaints have been sent to superior authorities in Washington, D.C., demanding an exhaustive, federal investigation against the Clearwater Company and its director, Harold Benton." Images appeared on the screen of the river, turned into a toxic black surface, dead fish floating belly up, and furious residents holding up handwritten signs. I glanced sideways at Sarah and saw her squeezing my hand tightly, her eyes trembling, but now shining with a faint, fragile ray of hope. "Grandma, they're talking about him," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I squeezed her hand back, holding back my own powerful emotion. "Yes, sweetie. Maybe justice is finally getting closer to the truth." The very next day, the atmosphere in the town was buzzing with nervous energy. I was in the yard when I heard the distinct sound of police sirens approaching in the distance. Patrol cars and reporters suddenly surrounded the entrance to the Clearwater offices just a few blocks from my house. People crowded around like it was a local festival, holding up handwritten signs that demanded, "Give us back the clean river," and Harold Benton must answer for his crimes. From a distance, I watched the shouting crowd, my heart divided between my private pain and this burgeoning public hope. Those people weren't just fighting for the river, they were also fighting for victims like Sarah, those whom Harold had trampled in the darkness. I wanted to take Sarah to see the public outrage, but she shook her head, hiding behind the door, whispering, "I'm scared, Grandma. I don't want anyone to see me, not yet." I hugged her and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. I'll be right here. Your courage is in your heart, not on the street." The local news station soon broadcast an interview with Inspector Miller, the same head of the local police investigation I had spoken to. He appeared on television in his impeccable uniform, responding in a smooth, dismissive voice. "We have conducted a preliminary inspection and have not found any serious irregularities." I felt the blood rush instantly to my head, my hands gripping the arm of the couch until they hurt. They hadn't found anything? What was he talking about when the whole town knew the river had died because of Harold's company? Sarah, next to me, her gaze darkened again, as if the newly lit spark of hope had been immediately and brutally extinguished. "Grandma, they're not going to do anything," she murmured, utterly lost. I wanted to comfort her, but my throat closed up with renewed fury, and I couldn't utter a word. The deliberate, blatant cover-up by local law enforcement, clearly visible on the news, reinforced the deep-seated culture of impunity enjoyed by the wealthy elite, a social truth that often renders conventional justice routes useless for the powerless. But just a few hours later, Like a bolt of shocking lightning in a clear sky, a short video clip appeared on social media, which spread with incredible viral speed. I don't understand much about modern technology, but the girl from the market showed it to me on her phone. The video, taken secretly from surveillance cameras inside the precinct, clearly showed Inspector Miller receiving a thick, unmarked envelope from Harold, while both men laughed easily, like old, familiar friends. "Do you see, Mrs. Mary?" the girl said with raw outrage. "Even the police are compromised at the top. It's proof." I felt my heart pounding violently, caught between overwhelming rage and a strange, potent relief. The truth, even if it was just a small piece of the corruption, had finally been exposed to the light. The news of the video immediately agitated the whole town, turning private suspicion into undeniable public certainty. If even the local police are corrupt, surely the higher, federal authorities will have to step in now, said an old man at the fresh drink stand with evident simmering anger. I stayed among the crowd, listening with a strange, fierce feeling in my chest. Hope and fear, battling each other at the same time. If even the local police were bought and on Harold's side, could we truly fight him, a wealthy corporate monster? But then I thought of Sarah, of those nights when she cried inconsolably in her room, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't surrender. Just as expected, only a few days later, a committee of interagency inspectors from Washington, D.C. appeared. They arrived suddenly, without prior notice, catching the whole town, and more importantly, Harold Benton, completely by surprise. I was in the yard, tending to my plants, watching intently as the official vehicles, black and imposing, stopped dramatically in front of the Clearwater Company headquarters. I saw them immediately shut down the plant, take official samples of the wastewater, and demand all the company's accounting ledgers. Local television news crews filmed the precise moment the police, now federal agents, asked Harold to step forward for questioning. He was still wearing his perfectly ironed white shirt. He still tried, desperately, to maintain his false, arrogant smile. But I noticed the visible beads of sweat on his forehead and a fleeting, unmistakable flash of raw panic in his gaze. He's terrified, I thought with a deep, cold satisfaction. And for the very first time since this nightmare began, I felt a slight, potent sense of relief wash over me, although the deep, emotional pain was still there, like a chronic wound that never truly heals. The press began an immediate, relentless process of uncovering a series of shocking cases. It turned out that the Clearwater Company had systematically paid multiple, enormous fines to evade legitimate environmental inspections, and all the previous files related to these crimes were covered up by Inspector Miller and a powerful group of local, complicit officials. Every article, every searing newscast was like a sharp dagger thrust against the thick, suffocating veil of corruption that Harold had meticulously created over years. I read every word with a painful, simmering heart, full of fresh rage. He hadn't just severely harmed Sarah. He had also poisoned the river, and consequently, the lives of so many innocent people in this community for the sake of profit. The systemic corruption, which allowed Harold to trade public health for private wealth, was a grim validation of the taxi driver's earlier warning, a widespread ethical failure often seen in communities where corporate money heavily influences local governance. That night, Sarah and I were sitting on the patio, looking towards the central town square. The neighbors had spontaneously organized a vigil with candles, illuminating a part of the dark sky. The small flames flickered gently like tiny, fragile stars in the darkness, and I watched them reflect intensely in my granddaughter's eyes. Sarah reached out, took my hand firmly, and whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "Grandma, maybe justice really is coming for us." I hugged her tight, tears running silently down my face, the first tears of hope I had shed in months. "Yes, sweetie, I believe it too," I choked out. The news of Harold's preventative arrest spread like a wildfire, shaking the entire foundation of Phoenix. I heard people commenting everywhere, from the corner market to the neighborhood cafe, all speaking with voices full of palpable indignation and profound, renewed hope. The day of the trial, I woke up with the first light, my heart restless and pounding with nervous anticipation. I called Sarah, who was huddled in her room, her eyes still swollen and bruised after so many nights spent without restful sleep. "Sweetie, today is an important day. We're going to the courthouse, okay?" I said, making a deliberate effort to sound gentle and encouraging. She nodded slowly, but there was an immense, visible weight in her eyes, as if every single step she took was an unbearable burden. I squeezed her hand, trying to transmit the little strength I was desperately trying to gather myself. We arrived early at the city courthouse, amidst the surging crowd that was rapidly gathering at the entrance. The atmosphere was boiling, thick with contained emotion, like a powerful flame about to erupt. People held up handwritten signs that screamed, "Justice for the victims" and "No more monsters disguised as good men." Seeing those words, those public declarations, I felt a strange, complex mix of raw pain for what Sarah had suffered, and at the same time, the exhilarating hope that justice would finally, irrevocably be done. Sarah pressed tightly against me, her icy hands trembling violently in mine. "Grandma, there are too many people. I'm scared," she murmured, shrinking from the crowd. I stroked her back and replied in a low, firm voice, "I'm with you, sweetie. Today, he will have to face the truth of what he did, and you don't have to carry this alone." When the police brought Harold out of the transport van, the crowd erupted in shouts of pure, unadulterated fury. He was wearing a stark, institutional gray prison uniform, his hair messy, his face pale and drawn, with absolutely no trace of that elegant, arrogant director from before. Several furious people managed to throw rotten eggs and mud at him amidst a wave of intense boos and shouts. I looked at him and saw how his former arrogant gaze now darted everywhere, frantically avoiding the eyes of the people. He's trembling with fear, I thought, and a corner of my heart felt a small, fierce sense of victory, although the profound pain of the past was still there, like a wound that will never completely heal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was so tense that it was almost stifling, heavy with expectation. The place was spacious, with rows of gleaming wooden benches completely packed with people. I sat down firmly next to Sarah, feeling her shallow, shaky breathing against my arm. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a harsh, cutting voice, stood up to read the long, detailed indictment. The litany of crimes was enumerated one by one: abuse against multiple women, bribery of public officials, and severe environmental pollution leading to ecological disaster. Every single word he pronounced fell like a heavy hammer blow, sinking the entire room into absolute, profound silence. I squeezed Sarah's hand and felt hers cling back with more force, desperately, as if she were holding on to me so as not to completely collapse. One after another, the witnesses took the stand. First was Martha, my old friend, who walked slowly but spoke with a firm, unyielding conviction. She recounted in detail how Harold had called her to his office, locked the door, and tried to force himself on her. "I was lucky to escape, but I lost my job, and also my dignity," she said in a broken but clear voice. Next came a young secretary, her eyes red, recounting the numerous times Harold abused his corporate power to harass her. Then came the laborers who had worked at Clearwater, each with their own painful story, but all agreeing on the same horrifying thing. Harold was a monster meticulously disguised as a man. I listened with a heavy heart, thinking of Sarah, of all those months of paralyzing silence and solitary fear that she had to endure. Then, it came to Sarah's turn. I felt her whole body tremble violently when she heard her name called. "You can do this," I whispered, squeezing her hand one last tight time before she went up to the stand. She wore a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back tightly, and her face was pale, although there was a new fragile firmness in her gaze that I had never seen before. She began to speak, her voice initially trembling slightly. "I am the daughter of his wife. I suffered horrible things from that man for a long time." The large courtroom fell completely silent, as if holding its collective breath. Her voice grew stronger, rising with the truth. "And I got pregnant. I had his child, but the baby died from a congenital heart condition." Her devastating declaration resonated clearly, strongly, like a sharp blade cutting forcefully through the air. The courtroom erupted in collective, shocked gasps. Some people burst immediately into tears. A loud murmur swelled intensely among the crowd. Harold suddenly jumped up from his seat, ready to shout his innocence. "She's lying. I didn't do anything." But the judge instantly banged the table with the gavel and ordered firmly, "Silence is required in the courtroom. Order." I looked at Sarah, filled with a painful, profound pride. My granddaughter, the same one who once huddled fearfully in a dark corner, was now standing tall, confronting the monster who had destroyed her life. I wanted to run up and hug her, but I could only stay there, letting the tears of pride and sorrow run silently down my cheeks, knowing that her truth was now unshakable. I looked at Sarah, filled with a painful, profound pride. My granddaughter, the same one who once huddled fearfully in a dark corner, was now standing tall, confronting the monster who had destroyed her life. I wanted to run up and hug her, but I could only stay there, letting the tears of pride and sorrow run silently down my cheeks, knowing that her truth was now unshakable. The act of public truth-telling, known in psychological terms as trauma narrative exposure, marked the crucial first step toward reclaiming agency and self-worth, a moment of profound psychological power. In that instant of powerful silence, I caught sight of Linda, my daughter, sitting quietly in the last row of the courtroom. Her face was drawn, hollow, with no trace of the haughty woman who once wore expensive Gucci dresses. Her eyes were terribly red, and she looked at Sarah with an expression filled with palpable pain and deep, agonizing regret. At the very end of the session, when people began to quietly leave the courtroom, Linda approached me, her hands trembling violently. "Mom, Sarah, please forgive me," she said through raw sobs, tears streaming uncontrollably down her cheeks. I was too blind, too selfish to believe him. I was terribly wrong. I looked her straight in the eye, feeling my soul ripped open by her words. "Your words reopen old festering wounds, Linda. When you slapped Sarah, when you chose to defend Harold's money instead of protecting your own flesh and blood daughter," I replied in a cold, steady voice, heavy with agonizing pain. "My granddaughter almost lost her entire life because of your devastating blindness and greed. As of today, I no longer have a daughter named Linda." Linda immediately collapsed, crying inconsolably onto the bench, but I couldn't stay there, not for a moment longer. I turned my back and hugged Sarah tightly, feeling her body shaking in my arms. "You did an amazing job, sweetie," I whispered, hiding my own fresh tears against her hair. The trial concluded days later with a decisive, just sentence. Harold received the maximum possible sentence for his crimes, along with several corrupt officials who were also prosecuted and convicted. Justice, though agonizingly delayed and hard-won, had finally arrived, a monumental victory over systemic corruption and personal evil. After the trial's dramatic conclusion, my granddaughter's life and mine slowly, tentatively began to find their rhythm again. Although the deep scars on Sarah's heart remained, I tried to do absolutely everything possible to give her some measure of peace. Every morning I cooked simple, comforting meals, watered the chrysanthemum pots in the patio, and told her funny, simple stories from my own youth to cheer up the heavy atmosphere. Sometimes Sarah would actually smile, but that smile was fragile, fleeting, like a breeze that passes and easily vanishes. I knew that to truly heal, we needed time, profound psychological support, and perhaps also those small, quiet miracles that life sometimes provides. One late afternoon, while I was peacefully watering the chrysanthemums and the golden sunset light fell over the patio, making the wet petals shine, a gentle, tentative knock was heard at the door. I wiped my wet hands on my apron. I went to open it and was surprised to see Jason, Sarah's devoted ex-boyfriend, standing there. He wore a simple blue shirt, held a modest bouquet of white chrysanthemums, and his tired eyes looked sincere and deeply remorseful. "Mrs. Mary," he said, his voice slightly trembling with emotion. "I'm so terribly sorry for having left when Sarah needed me most. I truly didn't know anything about the truth. I honestly thought she had broken up with me because she no longer had feelings for me. After reading everything in the newspaper, I finally understood that I was gravely wrong. I want to be here by her side, Mrs. Mary, if she will let me." I looked at him intently, feeling a complex mixture of warmth and deep, protective distrust. This boy had been the one Sarah truly loved, but he was also the one who, however innocently, abandoned her in her most difficult, terrifying moment. "Are you absolutely serious, Jason?" I asked him with a serious, unyielding voice. "Sarah has been through way too much pain and trauma. If you're not absolutely serious about commitment, do not hurt her again." Jason nodded firmly, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I swear it, Mrs. Mary. I want to spend the rest of my life making things right for her." I finally smiled, feeling a profound sense of relief, and then called inside. "Sarah, come here for a moment, sweetie." Sarah came out slowly, her eyes widening in disbelief when she saw Jason standing there. She stood utterly motionless for a long moment, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. And then, suddenly, she started to cry, not tears of sorrow, but of intense emotional release. Jason didn't say much in the face of her tears. He just gently placed the bouquet of flowers into her hands and murmured in a warm, low voice, "Sarah, not all men are like him. You deserve to be truly loved, and I want to be the one to do it." She didn't answer with words. She simply hugged him tightly, crying inconsolably into his shoulder. I stayed there, watching them both, my heart filled with sadness for their journey, but also with a potent, fierce hope for their future. In Sarah's tear-filled eyes, I saw a tiny, delicate light shining after so many months of crushing darkness, like a candle that had just been gently lit. The return of Jason, representing genuine, uncorrupted love, offered Sarah a vital pathway back to normalcy, a critical external validation that the trauma did not have to define her capacity for future happiness. A few weeks after Jason's heartfelt return, I decided that Sarah needed more than just family support, so I took her to see a professional psychologist downtown. I knew that the deep internal wounds she carried wouldn't heal just with time or with love alone. The therapy sessions were held in a small, quiet room with soft, calming light and the gentle, therapeutic scent of lavender oil. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a warm, steady voice, patiently encouraged Sarah to express everything she had kept tragically silent about for so long. At first, Sarah remained completely quiet, reserved, but little by little, she began to open up, even if it was just in short, fragmented phrases. "I feel like I'm not myself anymore, Grandma," she told me once on the way back home, her voice full of raw, honest pain. I took her hand firmly and whispered to her, "You are still your grandma's Sarah, honey, much stronger and more resilient than you think you can be." At the same time, I took another crucial step. I enrolled Sarah and myself in a community women's support group called New Light. It was an association founded by women who had been through intense suffering, ranging from domestic violence to various forms of abuse. They met regularly to cook for charity, share their painful stories, and help each other heal and rebuild their lives. The first time we went, Sarah was intensely shy. She stayed huddled in a corner, listening quietly to the others share their terrifying journeys. I noticed how her gaze slowly began to change from fear. It moved to curiosity, and then, crucially, to a glimmer of empathy and connection. "Grandma, I'm not the only one," she told me at the end of the meeting, her voice soft but now full of profound, shared emotion. At one group meeting, while everyone was busy preparing casseroles for the needy children, an older woman kindly suggested that each person share a personal story to inspire the others. I looked at Sarah, fully expecting her to refuse as always, but unexpectedly, she stood up slowly. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her gaze was suddenly firm and resolute. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice still a little shaky, but clear. "I was abused by my stepfather for a long time. I got pregnant. I had a baby, but he tragically died from a congenital heart condition. I thought I couldn't go on living. I wanted to end it all. But today, I'm here to say that I won't let that immense pain define who I am. I am taking my life back." The entire room fell into a powerful, heavy silence, and then a wave of warm, heartfelt applause erupted. The women stood up, surrounding Sarah, hugging her fiercely. Some were crying, others were smiling with pride. I, sitting in the back rows, felt the tears running silently down my cheeks. For the very first time since the tragedy began, I saw my granddaughter hold her head high, speak with a clear, resonant voice, no longer with that terrifying tremor of fear. I was proud, but more than anything, I knew that Sarah was rediscovering herself, step by painful, powerful step. That night on the way home, the sky was clear and vast, and the silver moon shone softly, illuminating our path. Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered to me, "Grandma, I'm going to keep pushing forward, not just for me, but also for other women, for those who have gone through the same terrifying thing as me. I want to be a voice." I stopped walking immediately, hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her fragile, yet newly strengthened body. "You are my light, Sarah," I said, my voice choked with overwhelming love and relief, "and I truly believe you will be a guiding light for many, many more people." When we arrived home, I stayed in the patio for a long time, watching how the moonlight illuminated the fully bloomed chrysanthemum pots, symbols of enduring grief and respect. I thought about the dark days of pain, about the great-grandson we lost, about Linda, the daughter I once loved, who was now just a distant, heartbreaking memory. Harold and those like him took too many things from us all. But looking at Sarah, at her newfound resolve, I understood that they could never, ever tear the light and the truth from our hearts. I took my granddaughter's hand, and we walked into the house together. Our hearts were filled with a new, quiet certainty. No matter how dark and brutal the past has been, the light of truth always finds a way to shine, and courage is the ultimate, final act of revenge against a monster. Life has taught me a hard lesson. Staying silent in the face of profound evil only gives it more power and more victims. True, protective love is not about covering up or enduring abuse in silence, but having the fierce, undeniable courage to stand up and protect those we love at any personal cost. Family bonds can break tragically, hearts can change and harden, but justice and truth will always, always come out into the light in the end. I want to tell everyone watching, never turn your back on the pain of your loved ones. Do not allow a false sense of honor or a fear of embarrassment to silence the voice of your true conscience. Believe in the incredible power of truth. Fight until the very end for justice, because only then can we give others a fair life and the certainty that good, although sometimes agonizingly delayed, will always, always prevail. And for those who dedicate themselves to committing evil, remember this profound truth. No amount of power, money, or cover-ups can hide your crimes forever. Evil may reign temporarily in the darkness, but sooner or later, the light will expose it completely, and then the ultimate price you pay will be much, much higher than you ever could have imagined. The story you have just heard has had names and locations changed to protect the identity of those involved. We tell it not to judge, but with the desperate hope that someone listens and stops to reflect. How many mothers are suffering in absolute silence inside their own homes right now? I truly wonder, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you choose to stay silent to keep a false peace, or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your own voice and the truth? I want to know your opinion, because every story shared can become a candle that illuminates someone else's terrifying path. God always blesses, and I am deeply convinced that courage will lead us all to better days. Now, on the final screen, I will leave 2 of the channel's most cherished stories. I am sure they will surprise and move you. Thank you for staying with me until this final, powerful moment.